legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Keith Thompson, who joins us to discuss his latest book, The UFO Paradox, The Celestial and Symbolic World of Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. In case after case related to UFO encounters and other unknown aerial phenomena, or UAP, the same impasse is reached. Testimony from witnesses on one side, dismissive responses from the authorities on the other. In the fertile void of this deadlock, however, lie extraordinary possibilities about the nature of mind and matter, spirit and soul, transforming the UFO into a celestial, metaphysical event. Thompson reveals how the UFO phenomenon ultimately represents a call from the cosmos for humanity to open to greater dimensions of reality and recognize that our understanding of the universe is still far from complete. Hello and welcome, Keith, and thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Greg, it's great to be with you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So am I, very much so. I absolutely love the new book that's entitled The UFO Paradox, The Celestial and Symbolic World of Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. But I came across your work actually many years earlier, Angels and Aliens. I know you've got some news to share on that, which we'll do at some point. That's going to be put back in print again after such a long time. Before we dive into our subject today, just for listeners who don't know, could you just give us a little potted bio?
Yeah, I'll simply start with, first, I'm a journalist. I've written opinion pieces, especially for the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, other newspapers, largely in the United States. Done a lot of feature stories for weekly newspapers and magazines and so forth. And I've been a long-time observer of the UFO phenomenon. I've recently was asked by a host of a podcast, how did I make the decision to shift from being a mainstream investigative journalist to a UFO researcher or a UFO writer? And I knew that something wasn't quite right about the way the question was being teed up. And I said, there's no real shift. I didn't go from being an investigative journalist to studying UFOs. I am applying my skills or my background as an investigative journalist. And I've just simply taken on a topic that is maybe a little further out, a little more controversial, but it certainly doesn't involve a shift of my methods or my approach in any topic I've covered. As a journalist, I'm taking an empirical approach. What's the evidence, especially when there's a claim involved? And then what's the other side say? And maybe there's more than one side. But specifically, I came to be interested in the UFO phenomenon as really quite some time ago. I'm a middle era baby boomer, just so that puts me in all your listeners can kind of do the math on that. I guess it's the top of the food chain right now. We're the old guys. So I was 12 years old, and I was in the 6th grade. And it was my turn to give a current events report in my class. And the way that worked, we would follow, the assignment was when it was our turn, we knew when it was going to be. I had a couple of weeks' notice to prepare. And the idea was to find an item in the news, a story in the news, especially one that might have some widespread interest, and bring it to class. Bring clippings from the newspaper or any other props, any other teaching devices. So at that time, I had no interest or awareness of the UFO phenomenon. I was growing up in the state of Ohio in the Midwest in the United States. And in the state just north, Michigan, there was a 4 or 5 day, what they call a UFO flap, FLAP, which means a sighting that goes on for a few different days. And people were reporting lights and objects in the sky and strange encounters. for several days, and even became an item on the national network news in the United States, CBS especially. The Walter Cronkite CBS Evening News led 2 or 3 nights in a row with the latest news on Hillsdale, Michigan. So I brought that to my class, and I reported about the controversy, people reporting what they had seen, and then the usual, what I call the agents of official culture, who take it upon themselves to remind us politely, condescendingly, usually, that that didn't happen the way the witnesses said. They were deceived by their senses, or perhaps it was deliberate hoax, or misidentified natural objects. I thought, well, that's an interesting immediate response. People in science and the news media and academia just reflexively going to why it can't be real. I didn't have a dog in the fight that said it has to be extraterrestrials or some other interpretation. I thought, well, why would we automatically rule it off the table? So even as a kid, I thought, this is fascinating. Now, I wouldn't automatically dismiss any report, but I would still ask for proof. So here's why I'm telling this story about my orientation as a young person. At one point, it came time for me to take questions in class after I talked about, 10-minute, 15-minute report, verbal. And one of my classmates raised her hand and said, Keith, what do you think they saw? There had been a controversy about whether one of the sightings in town might have been as a result of swamp gas, which is a natural phenomenon around swamps and bogs, where there's an outgassing of natural methane and carbon dioxide and other gases, which sometimes can catch fire. And so there's luminous phenomena around swamps. They call it swamp gas, and there are lights that are seen. So she said, do you think that if it wasn't swamp gas, what do you think they saw? And I answered honestly. As the empiricist, I said, well, I don't know what they saw. They've reported things that don't make sense conventionally, in conventional terms, but it certainly doesn't sound like swamp gas as an accurate, comprehensive interpretation. So my teacher at that point walked forward and said, what she said to the class standing next to me, pretty much on my side, said, what Keith, I think, is trying to tell us, it's important to keep an open mind and ask relevant questions. Is that it, Keith? I said, yeah, that is it. And then she said, let me tell you, Mr. Thompson. She shifted to calling me by my full name, which sometimes can mean trouble. But in this case, she said, let me say, Mr. Thompson, that was a fine report. You have the makings of a scientist or a journalist, maybe even a detective. And then she led, I can still see her sort of putting her hands together in fists rather enthusiastically. She kept saying, follow the evidence wherever it leads. And Greg, that had a huge impact on me. First of all, for an adult to speak to me as an aspiring adult, 12 years old, I knew I didn't have all the answers, but it's really something nice about being taken seriously. And she felt I'd done a good job and I could be a scientist or a detective or a reporter. I remember that because all three of those careers have something in common. A detective looks for facts. No smart detective rules any suspect out of bounds in advance unless they've got a solid alibi. And that likewise, you don't accuse someone without evidence. Same as science. Science ostensibly is about, let's look with what the data tells us. Are there alternative interpretations? You've got to look out for arguing for the interpretation that you want. And likewise with journalism, there are different degrees of opinion in journalism, obviously, different kinds. But still, it should be fact-based, and there's nothing worse for a reporter to write a story and find they followed a source that they should have checked out and found out that it was a bad source. So anyway, I can't tell you that on that day, at age 12, I became a UFO investigator, but I left that classroom report, went out to the recess like all the other kids on the playground, and became a 12-year-old again. But I went away from that thinking, I'm going to keep paying attention to this. So I read the books, and that same pattern continued, Greg. Ordinary, credible people would report incredible, extraordinary things and encounters with very strange phenomena. The official agents of culture step in and largely say that didn't happen because it couldn't happen. And I thought, nope, that's not the way it works. A true skeptic doesn't take a side against an unusual phenomenon. It presses for proof that would be convincing that it is something non-ordinary. So that's my approach, and that's how I got into this, and have happened to have written 2 books about it.
Well, it's interesting that you used the word ostensibly when you mentioned science there. We'll get to that and the thorny issue of scientism in due course. My starting point, often when I'm having casual discussions about this topic, I'm just with the lay people, shall we say, people who maybe haven't looked at it in any great detail, but there's something comes up in the media, a bit like what happened, with the US government stuff in 2021. Whatever that amounted to. But anyway, regarding the term UFO, which is now officially changed to UAP, but UFO, people are saying things like, I don't believe in UFOs. What's happening? And even with some people who should know much better, they're conflating UFO with ET.
They absolutely are. They absolutely are. Even the news, mainstream news media, I'll give you a good example. Extraordinary sighting. Could it have been a UFO? They lead at the top of the hour. I go, well, by definition, it's a UFO. It is unidentified. It appears to be flying or airborne, and it has the visual and maybe other indicators of being an object, especially if it was picked up on radar. So there's no doubt that it's a UFO, but what they mean is it ET? Could it be ET? It could be, but actually I've come to believe that's not even the most probable interpretation. So there's an unusual approach. I think it's real. I say, is it real? But that does not mean real. Does not necessarily mean extraterrestrial. In the way that Steven Spielberg, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, certainly have primed us to expect.
Well, exactly, and also the question of is it real? I mean, we can then get into well, what is real? If you see what I mean. So, what level of reality does something have to manifest to qualify as "quote unquote" real? But in any event, if the proverbial flying saucer landed on the White House lawn and little green men got out, people would be saying, "Oh my God, did you see that UFO?" Well, it's no longer a UFO. It seems to be an alien craft with aliens in it, if you see what I mean. So it ceases to become a UFO at that point. But yeah, so that's just a bit of a bugbear of mine, and I'm amazed at some, otherwise serious researchers and commenters and writers in this area using those terms interchangeably. So,
well, the reader who goes to my book, if they're inclined to read my book, The UFO Paradox, will see that I devoted a large part of the introduction, or maybe it's the first chapter, I think it's the introduction, to a discussion of, a term in philosophy called phenomenology. Maybe some of your listeners know that. We don't really need to define the term, other than that, certainly there's a difference between, I write about what people report. Observations are one thing. People make extraordinary observations. Then the interpretation should be a secondary step. And you put that in brackets at first. You say, okay, it could have been from outer space, but let's just put that aside and say, what did people report? So that is exactly, I'm a phenomenologist. Phenomenon is from the Greek for appearance, that which appears. Every day we live as phenomena. We go out the door and we see what we expect, and the nature of that reality. You can debate, or do we live in a simulation, and all those great topics. But we all we have are appearances: visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, and then we have an interpretive impulse to make sense of it. We have to make sense, but we need, I think, with this phenomenon, a kind of a different sense-making apparatus than ordinary reality teaches us, and that's a big part of what my basic. I would summarize, as having read the book. Yes, it's real, but it demands by its appearances and by its apparent nature that we update our maps of reality. It's a part of reality we don't fully acknowledge can exist, including and especially the paranormal dimensions, which. When I say that it's paranormal, then people say, "Oh, well, you believe in the paranormal." Well, I believe in gravity. I can't explain gravity. Nobody can explain it very well. But yes, I believe. If you want to say, the word belief is often, as you know, a kind of a cudgel. So it's an accusation. Oh, you believe, and I go, well, I certainly believe. Well, in my case, I don't certainly believe, but I believe it's a real phenomenon because the evidence is very strong for something that, again, doesn't fit our maps. So my view is that when there are phenomena like UFOs, near-death phenomena, paranormal phenomena of various kinds that consistently don't make it onto the maps of Western scientism, as you referred to it, then at some point it behooves us to say, maybe it's the maps. The phenomenon is what it is. Nature is already doing what it's doing. The way we describe nature, what nature is not yet settled. So, we've been redefining our maps ever since the scientific revolution began, though our maps are not complete, is my view.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And we have this tendency, probably humans were like this throughout much of our history, to the extent we really know how far back that goes, of trying to interpret the unfamiliar, the unknown, even if it was familiar or known to those who came before us, but what we're experiencing in our time through the what's established as science or knowledge or acceptable or explained or even explainable right now. So it's like, as you say, this cannot have happened because it is not possible. Even though it did happen, people are saying, I experienced this, and said, well, you couldn't have because it's not possible. And we have what we think, I suppose, at the minute is a scientific paradigm that's the most expansive and inclusive and, in every dimension, depth, width, and height, that the biggest it's ever been. But that's absolutely not the case. It's just how things are right now. And as you say, you're excluding things. It would make for very poor police investigation to start saying that these things are not possible. At the very least, to get to the bottom of a situation, the detective would have to say, okay, so that sounds completely bizarre, inexplicable, but if it was the case, it would explain this thing that happened. So let's look at that and see, is there any way? Let's look at it more and see, are we looking at something? Do we look at something from a different angle? Do we need to take other things into account? What would explain this inexplicable thing? How would things have to be for that to happen?
Yeah, and that's a very good point. And I use the legendary famous case of the astronomer Galileo, who, as you know, used his computations based on what Copernicus had found before him. And he also added the empirical touch of using a device called a telescope, which was kind of a newfangled thing. You could use an instrument to expand upon the human sense capacity to interpret the world. So he began to I don't know exactly how he began to report on it, but he began to tell people, we've got a fundamental mistake here. Almost like in the astronaut world, Houston, we've got a problem. And what Galileo was announcing, in effect, to his peers, we've got a problem. We've been saying that the sun orbits the earth. It's actually the other way around. The earth orbits the sun. Well, he got a knock on his door one day, metaphorically speaking, from the then official arbiters of what we now call science, the Roman Catholic Church. And it's not to say that the Catholics are worse. If the Protestants had been up to speed, they would have done it too, probably. It's not in the Bible. It's not true. Although there's a lot in the Bible, as you know, a lot of miracles, so-called, that we take for granted, religious people take for granted. Anyway, they told Galileo, we'd like you to stop saying this. It's not true. And Galileo rather naively said, well, look, sit down over at my desk over there. There are all my charts and computations and my equations. And they looked and they said, also, look at this, my telescope. Look through it yourself. His whole premise was, you don't have to take my word for it. That day we're bigger than that now, aren't we? You can see for yourself, and it can be replicated by different observers. And they famously said, the Catholic inquisitors, in their purple gowns, no doubt, said, no, we're not going to look through your telescope. That's become a metaphor for the refusal to be open-minded, refusing to look through Galileo's telescope. Didn't want to see it. And they said, if you don't stop saying this, we'll put you under house arrest. Well, he didn't stop, and so they did. They put him under house arrest. He wasn't tortured, wasn't burned at the stake like some other unfortunate observers of the time, of nature were at the time. But anyway, that's a great, I use the Galileo the Galileo example. And funny, I don't know how many decades, it's really centuries past. I believe it might have been as late as 1966, last century, when then one day the Vatican put out a release. Oh, by the way, we were wrong about Galileo. He was right. Well, by the way, Okay, well, it's better to correct the record than not to. But again, that's how knowledge grows, by finding anomalies that make the existing story questionable for the first time. Anomalies, that which don't fit the predictions. And as the anomalies grow larger and more, greater quantity, then a paradigm will change. A worldview will slowly change. It doesn't get announced in the daily newspapers, but maybe in our age, we'll have better accounts of what the nature of consciousness is, which I think is one of, as you know from my book, it's one of the big questions I raise. We've just got to come to terms with the most elementary data point that all of us have. We are aware. We know that we are. There's something it is like to be Greg. There's something it is like to be Keith, something subjectively real. I am. That is consciousness. What the nature of it is, there's a lot of room to talk, but to pretend that consciousness is just something we can put over on the side and say that it's not important is leaving a lot of things unexamined, such as the near-death phenomenon.
Yeah, well, in the tag cloud, legalizefreedom.com of subjects for all the podcast, consciousness, I think, is probably the biggest one. It crops up in so many different contexts and so many different talks on so many different subjects, and it makes it sound fundamental, which I think we have to understand it is. There's increasing evidence for that from all sorts of fields. That tardy response you mentioned from the church in relation to Galileo, well, there's that saying, I can't remember who it was attributed to, but that it might have been one of the quantum physics guys, science advances one funeral at a time. So in its own way, sort of institutionalized science feels very much like the church in that sense, that there's all sorts of politics and personalities and subjectivity swirling around there that are not really supposed to be part of the process. Rupert Sheldrake, if you've ever listened to him or read him, is as a scientist himself, and also a person with a spiritual dimension to his life. The Science and Spiritual Practices is one of his recent books, but he's very good on how scientists who believe themselves to be utterly objective, the language they use, his famous phrase was, for example, you're writing up your experiment and you'll say, a test tube was taken, not I took a test tube, because they're trying to write themselves out of the process. But the very revelations of the last century of science in the quantum realm has been revealing how you cannot separate the experiment from the experimenter in that sense. And certainly objectivity and subjectivity is that being a spectrum, shall we say, rather than two extremes. It's just a spectrum, basically the same thing, which is how something is viewed, regarded, and considered, is very, very relevant to the UFO UAP phenomena, the whole world of that.
I'm glad you mentioned Rupert Sheldrake. Sometimes when I'm expanding on this, I'll talk to somebody who might be a bit of a skeptic, which, by the way, skeptic is not a bad thing. I consider myself a skeptic. I say this phenomenon is real. It challenges us to update our maps, our paradigms, and so forth. I don't pull my punches on that, but that does not make me a believer in terms of I accept every claim. Skepticism refuses to admit anything or push anything off the table in advance for ideological reasons. It's the debunker, a kind of pseudo-skeptic, that does that. So when you mentioned Rupert Sheldrake, and I would mention him too. I've never met him, but I'll sometimes say to somebody I'll say, well, are you familiar with Rupert Sheldrake's work? And they'll say, oh, isn't he just a kind of a new age character? I mean, he's got these remarkable ideas. I go, yeah, he's got remarkable ideas about remarkable phenomena. And in fact, his books on science and the scientific method are pristine. He's a very, very vigilant and diligent yeoman laborer in the fields of science. So I give him big credit. Yes, he has bold ideas about morphic resonance and so forth as an alternative to genetic, to memory as the basis on which heritable traits are passed. Okay, he takes that empirically. He makes an empirical case for it. Doesn't mean he's solved all the questions, but science always advances, not only one funeral at a time when the old order just refuses to change their mind, but it advances one idea at a time. And he's a great example of doing He's a good worker. I like him a lot.
So, thinking about consciousness and the UFO, UAP question, uh, one of the big issues that you're addressing really is um, sort of the material explanation for it, i.e., physical craft, alien, ETs, perhaps piloting these things, and it all starts to look or sounds very like something that we're sort of alien and familiar at the same time. It's a craft, spacecraft with some form of fuel, some form of drive. It's being controlled by beings that might be very different from us, but they tend to have arms and legs, and it's the stuff of science fiction, and that's fine. I love science fiction. It's a rich world, and science fiction is great predictive power. So much science fiction has become science fact, not just in the realm of ET, but in all other genres and subgenres of sci-fi. However, it seems to me the richest mine has been for a long time, but increasingly so, is looking at the UFO UAP phenomenon in other ways. For example, I think it's accepted, quite common in many, being pop books on the subject, that it doesn't just have to be a physical explanation. Perhaps these beings and craft or whatever they are interdimensional. They're non-material in the way that we think of, three-dimensional reality. And but of course, anything smacking of the paranormal or of parapsychology is brushed aside by the ufologists who are very much in the nuts and bolts kind of realm. But certainly, this is the case you set out in your book, which I think is one of the best books on the subject I've ever read, simply because it does this so comprehensively and so convincingly, is to look not only at these other areas, like where how phenomena can manifest, and see how that maps onto what people are actually experiencing, rather than just saying, if you saw a light in the sky, it was probably a flying saucer with little green men in it. And also, not just thinking Roswell as some kind of starting point. It probably was a starting point for something, the saucer idea. Not
Yes.
what I can't remember the name of the guy. You'll remind us in a minute. The one who had that experience when he's a pilot. But
Yes.
also Roswell is kind of the beginning of the modern era. But hang on a minute. All of these things, or many of these things that people are witnessing, as strange and bizarre and inexplicable and seemingly impossible as they are, we find you can go back to ancient civilizations, um, Sumeria or whatever, and you read the text and they're talking about chariots of fire, these blazing things seen in the sky at night and having terrifying the people, etc., etc. And as you begin to look in different areas of research and study, maybe outside, in different fields, then folklore, for example, you begin to build up a picture of, hang on a minute, so phenomena somewhat similar to these, or very similar, or the same, have been experienced by people throughout time, but they've been interpreted and recorded differently. But did the commonalities here tell us anything about what we could be looking at?
That's exactly it was a key juncture in this field came when a researcher you no doubt know about, Jacques Valet, French astrophysicist and computer scientist, at the time had come to the conclusion based on his own, by the way, he had a sighting when he was a young astronomer. And it was decisive because what he saw was, again, remarkable. It made no sense. It appeared to have form and it appeared to have a saucer type shape. And then also when he was working at an observatory as a young astronomer, he had one of those kind of experiences that made it possible to question things in a way that he might not have. And that is, not only did the observatory record on their recording mechanism, their tape, I guess you'd say, an anomalous event in the sky. When he went to his bosses, his superiors, and said, "Could we have that tape, that recording?" They said, "No, we've erased it." He said, "You've erased it? Do we do that?" And the answer, in effect, was no, not normally, but that was an anomaly of some kind. It was clear to him, he could tell by the interaction, that the event was such that it had generated not a desire to cover it up in some malicious way, but to make it go away. It didn't fit the framework. He said, I saw something like repression in action. So anyway, he went on to become an exponent for a while of the ET hypothesis, that it could be, extragalactic visitors and so forth. But it, again, because he had an inquisitive mind and still does, he's late 80s or early 90s now, living in San Francisco, he wrote a book called Passport to Magonia. Magonia is an imaginary or a legendary mythological realm, sort of like Shambhala is to the Buddhists and Shangri-La in other mythologies. So Magonia was a legendary place in the French and Celtic lore that was there were miraculous, extraordinary, anomalous phenomena of all kinds: fairies, elves, poltergeists, creatures. Interacted with, for example, there are abductions of human beings by fairies in the fairy lore. And Valet had already become aware of the abduction phenomena. He said, is this likeness merely coincidental? And thinking like a phenomenologist, he said, there are two appearances of something similar. They are structurally alike. They involve the same archetypes. Well, here's the funny thing about what happened when he did that. He published that book, and he said we would be wise to consult the literature of mythology and folklore throughout the world. Well, the mainstream ufologists who were committed to the ET hypothesis, because they couldn't consider that it could be anything else, and they wanted to wrap this caper up as fast as possible, which is a big part of what motivates people. It's already hard enough on their career if you're in the engineering department at a university. You're taking UFOs seriously. You don't want to have to bring in fairies and elves to make it worse. I understand that, especially if you don't have tenure. Your job might be in jeopardy. Well, Valet, so they said, here we have Jacques Valet now saying it's all myth. It's all folklore. And he was amazed. He goes, no, I am not saying that. You must listen to me carefully. I can't do his French accent quite right, but it's very memorable. He said, I'm not saying it is just myth or just folklore. That is a dismissive framework. I'm saying we should consult what we call myth and folklore, because myth and folklore might refer to real events just as this does. So he broadened the category, he broadened the conversation considerably, had a great deal of influence on me. So I think such that I would say what we're dealing with in the UFO phenomenon is part of a larger framework of a super phenomenon, a meta phenomenon that generates for each culture, each era, phenomena that are consistent enough with the belief systems of the culture to allow the culture to even register it. What I mean by that is, if we were having reports that fairies, as in the traditional Celtic cultures, were abducting people in the United States, it would be considered nonsense. But we do have abduction reports involving creatures that are not entirely the same as the fairies, but it could well be that because we have a technological space age framework, then we interpret the phenomena so it's enough like what we expect. Well, likewise, the cultures of the fairy faith, they didn't have spaceships in those days, so they had encounters with fairies. So I think it makes it a harder topic to resolve overnight, but I don't think it's about resolving something overnight. It's about understanding that there may be a larger system of intelligence with which we act. Jacques Valet has a very poignant short statement. He says, the UFO phenomenon confronts the witness with the pre-existing frame of its own logic and affects the consciousness of the witness with the pre-existing logic, resulting in displays of arbitrary complexity. That's kind of dense. I'll just sort of unpack it. The logic of this intelligence interacts with the intelligence or the consciousness of the witness in such a way as to produce a compelling display of lights, of apparent craft of creatures that involve different degrees of complexity. And that's again, it's a dense way to think about it, but that is, I think, a good summary of why this is not an easy phenomenon to wrap up and to say, we're going to go to the hangars of McDonnell Douglas Aerospace or Lockheed Martin Aerospace, and we're going to take our sledgehammers and break the locker combinations and open it up, and we're going to find pristine spacecraft, and pickled aliens. I don't mean to make fun of it. I just am at some point, since I've been around this field for quite some time, one of the things I describe in both books, especially my first book, Angels and Aliens, is the power of the idea any day now. The lid on the government cover-up is going to blow sky high. Now, for people who only became aware of this phenomenon in 2017, when the New York Times came out with its really breakthrough story, front page, about the fact that the Pentagon, which had been saying for decades, generations, there's nothing going on, there's nothing we're paying attention to, these are all ordinary, mundane events in the sky. You can go back to your lives, people. We're in charge. We're the Air Force. Sky is okay. Well, the New York Times reported, no, there was a up till then secret task force that in fact was looking at the UFO phenomenon, but they were calling it unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs. So the new generation, I like to say, younger observers, people new to this phenomenon, think, well, since 2017, we've known that it's about to blow open. We're on the verge of popping the secret wide open. And I just often shake my head and I say, maybe this time you're right. But there's no mythology more well established in this field than the any day now we're going to get to the heart of it, mythology. And I say mythology not to say that it's false, but it's a story. Any day now we're going to get to the heart of it. And they go, what do you mean this is an old story? I go, it's been part of the expectation since 1947 when Kenneth Arnold saw the famous objects over Mount Rainier. A lot of the younger people, I end up sounding like an old guy, I'm the granddaddy or something of the field. But no, you just stay around long enough, you see patterns, you see how the patterns repeat. And if you just come into the phenomenon less than 10 years ago, you won't know. So again, this might be the time. Maybe those hangars that the aerospace office corporations have the recovered craft. But there's a lot of reasons to think, even if there is something recovered, what did they recover? It is highly classified. And in any case, it's not going to explain all of the phenomena by any means, because there are paranormal dimensions to this that are not something that you can lock up in a Air Force hangar.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com